we should get started. My name is Martin Bunton. I am the chair of the program committee at the Center for Global Studies. It is my real privilege this morning to chair the weekly Global Talks webinar, filling in for the director of the center, Oliver Schmidtka. Being the first Wednesday of the month, the center has organized one of its signature series, and today we're very pleased to be able to co-sponsor, co-host the speaker today with the Borders and Globalization Project, the big project, an amazing, incredible group of experts from around Canada, from around the world. And so we especially thank Emmanuel and his amazing team for all they do and for their help in putting this together. Our speaker today, David Newman, is one of the lead scholars and international partners with the program. Now I shall introduce David in a moment. Let me first, however, start today's webinar with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land, and I suppose the air and the sky and the clouds, continue to this day. A few housekeeping issues to consider before we get started. Please keep your microphone muted and your camera turned off unless instructed. Those instructions will come towards the end when we have time for questions. Feel free to use the chat feature to engage in discussion and debate with other participants and to share resources. When it comes to questions, we'll ask you to use the chat function to write your questions, and then we will collect those, gather those questions, and direct them towards our speaker. If you, alternatively, you could also use the raise hand function. I'll put another slide up to show any newcomers how that works. Finally, to note that this presentation is being recorded. So if you would like to anonymously ask a question, you could email Stephanie directly at cfts@uvic.ca, and we'll make sure that, well, time permitting, that your question will be asked. So just to go review this one more time with a visual, please mute your speaker. Please turn off your camera until it's time for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you could use the chat function at the bottom. And if you'd like to see how other people chat and how that works, you press that little purple arrow on the bottom right-hand corner. And one final slide to remind you that the session is being recorded, which also means that you have access to previous webinars that have been recorded if you'd like to look at the archive there. And this slide also reminds me to say a few other thank yous, including especially to Jody and Stephanie, who really are the masterminds making all of this work today. So thank you, Stephanie and Jody. Our speaker today, David Newman, as I mentioned earlier, one of the lead scholars and international partners with the big Borders and Globalization program. He is a professor of political geography and geopolitics at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Israel, where he also founded the Department of Politics and Government and has also served as dean. He has published widely in both scientific and popular outlets, including a weekly column with the Jerusalem Post on the subject of territory, on the subject of borders, as well as other social, political, and economic and academic issues. And today's presentation will examine the changing dynamics of Israel's borders with a particular focus on Israel, West Bank, and a future Palestinian state. David, I turn to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. What am I meant to be seeing now? Hello? Have I lost you?
David, sorry. I think we want to put your PowerPoint slides up now.
Okay, but they're with you. You're putting them up for me.
Yeah. David, you just go ahead and let us know when you would like your PowerPoint to start.
You can all see me, can you? Because I can't see myself. I mean, that's fine.
Yeah, we hear you. You're right. You just go ahead.
Okay, fine. Okay, yeah, I'm getting used to this technology. Okay, so I was going to say good evening to you all, because where I am sitting at this very moment in the south of Israel, it's just gone 8:30 in the evening, 10 hours difference in time from where you are in Western Canada, in Victoria. I think just the way that we're doing this session, of course, is about borders. You know, it's not the first time that we communicate by Zoom or by Skype or by WhatsApp, but the situation of the last 2 to 3 months has meant that much of our work now goes on through these platforms, Zoom, or the one that you're using, I think it's called Blackboard, and actually it's proving to be quite efficient. I don't know whether that's good news or bad news, but I've been involved in some of these in the last few weeks, where literally hundreds of people have attended sessions where otherwise maybe 30 or 40 would have attended, because you can just get in from anywhere in the world. The technology seems to be out there, and I think we're going to be having a big discussion and big debate about not only in universities but also in universities as to how this affects the way we work and travel and communicate, even when Corona is behind us. And it is also about borders in another way, because of course we've closed down so many borders because Corona, the virus, has shown us that however many billions we may invest in building, excuse expression, a bloody big wall between the USA and Mexico, or between Israel and the West Bank, and underneath and over and surveillance and everything else that's to do with it, along comes a virus and doesn't pay any attention to any of these walls and fences. So there's a lot going on in the world today which is about borders. And that's why I'm so pleased to be able to make this presentation, even though it's going to be a very case study sort of lecture. It's not going to be a theoretical lecture about borders. It's going to be very much a case study presentation on Israel's borders and a focus on Israel-Palestine borders. But I'm very pleased to be able to make it also as part, as you said, of the Borders and Globalization project, which is so ably directed and managed from your university by my friend and colleague, Professor Emmanuel Brunet Yaeli, who I know is hidden away there somewhere amongst the listeners at the moment. So I'm really pleased to be with you, and what I will do over the next 40-45 minutes is give you a very brief overview of Israel's borders. I'm going to be mostly working from a PowerPoint. I'm not going to be showing every slide. Some I'm going to jump over because there are over 50 of them in there. A lot of the slides are either pictures or maps, or my favorite, and that are caricatures. It's a mixture of them all, but I hope I can get the message across by using these visuals. So sit back, and I hope you enjoy. And obviously I'm very happy to discuss, to field questions and challenges to some of the things I say. I'm not here to talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict in its wider sense, or to get involved in a polemic of that sort of nature. I want to talk about borders, present the issues, and discuss some of these issues with the people in the audience. So I'll be quite happy now to move to the PowerPoint. Okay, and so that's the title. And as you can see from that semi-caricature, semi-picture on the front, or from the title as well, Israel's borders are unfinished business. You know, we do have lots of border issues in the world today, which trouble us, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But they don't tend to be issues of demarcation anymore. Most of the work that border scholars have been doing in the last 30 to 40 years are more about the functioning of borders, the dynamics of borders, the management, the power relations, how we negotiate borders, how we cross them. Very little is done these days, because it's simply not necessary, about the physical demarcation of the borders. Most states in the world have their borders determined. There are very few, hardly any conflicts in the world today which are about the location of borders. Israel is one of the few countries where it's still unfinished business. And we're going to look at some of that unfinished business and try and raise some questions. I don't believe I have the answers, but raise some of the questions as to where many of these border issues may be going. So very briefly, the structure is, I want to say, give a very brief overview of Israel's borders. then focus specifically on Israel and the West Bank and the dynamics of the changing Israel-Palestinian territorial configurations. Within that context, say something about the wall, the fence, the barrier, whichever terminology you want to use, about how borders are crossed in Israel and between Israel and her neighbours, and to conclude with a few comments about where, if at all, are the peace negotiations going? Are we still looking at the question of drawing borders? And what is this whole Trump deal of the century? Is there anything real to it? Or is it just another one of these grandiose ideas which have been raised and which don't have much future? So if I can say something about those themes over 40 minutes, I will have achieved something. Obviously, I'm probably going to have to focus on some of those topics and skip others. So that is a bad slide because the data is missing for some reason or other. So all I need to remind you, I'm sure you don't need reminding, is that the total size of Israel and the occupied territories, including the West Bank, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, is no more than 25,000 square kilometers, smaller than the whole of British Columbia. If we split up Israel and the occupied territories, and using very rough figures, Israel is about 20,000 square kilometers in its pre-67 borders. The West Bank and the Golan Heights and the minuscule territory of the Gaza Strip is no more than another 5,500 square kilometers. So, of course, one of the issues we have to think about, without sounding too deterministic, is to remember that one of the reasons why it is so hard to come to a territorial agreement between Israel and the Palestinians as each of their respective populations grow, and they're growing quite rapidly relative to many other Western European societies, is because the territory is very small. Now, that may sound a bit deterministic, and we've gone beyond those sort of arguments and discussions, but it goes without saying, and it may seem a bit banal to have to say it, that if we did have a huge prairie area of a few 100,000 square kilometers, it may, I'm not saying it would, it may be an easier problem to resolve, at least the territorial dimension of that problem. I don't want to suggest that territory is the only issue which concerns us in the conflict. There are so many other issues to do with history and injustice and colonization and rights and sovereignty and identity. You name it, it's all there. Water and Jerusalem and holy sites. But obviously territory is a very central part of the conflict. And that's where my expertise focuses on. So think of a small country in conflict with its neighbours, and you've got at least 8 separate border issues which have to be thought about. Israel has a border with Egypt. We'll see one map for each of these borders as we move through. Israel has a border with Egypt, which does have international status because of the Camp David peace agreements back in the late 70s and early 80s. So that border is more or less resolved. Same goes for most of the between Israel and Jordan, not necessarily the part between the West Bank and Jordan. But Israel has peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan, and part of those peace agreements were the signing off on maps which demarcate the borders which were bilaterally negotiated and agreed. Israel has a border with Lebanon, which is still basically known as the Blue Line, based on the Armistice Line of 1948. And when Israel withdrew to that border after its invasion of Lebanon, when it came back inside Israel, more or less went back to that line. It's a line we know where the border will be if one day there would be a peace agreement with one small adjustment. Israel and Syria is also based on 2 completely different lines. The Armistice Line of 1948 and the Golan Heights, which until 1967 was part of Syria, after 67 was conquered by Israel. And of course, the Golan Heights is up for serious negotiations if Israel and Syria were ever to get back into a bargaining position. It doesn't seem likely at the moment. Only in the last few days, Israel has been operating its air force inside Syria against all sorts of Iranian missiles which have been coming through Syria's territory towards Lebanon. And I've heard some of those planes above me, because when those planes get moving, there's nowhere in the country you can't hear them, again, because it's such a small piece of territory. The big issue, Israel-Palestine and West Bank. The West Bank, a territory which resulted from what is known in Israel as its War of Independence, in Palestine as its Nakba, 1948, negotiated in the Rhodes Agreements in 1949. It's a very odd territory, but we'll talk more about that later. Israel also has a separate border with the Gaza Strip, from which it withdrew in 2005, but as you know, is a very problematic and sensitive and tense border, with missiles coming in one way and retaliations coming the other way. Jerusalem, we're not even going to get there today. People always used to say, Jerusalem is such a problematic issue to resolve. If you resolve every other issue, then you'll already be halfway along the path to resolving the problem of Jerusalem, because you will have gained greater trust by resolving the other issues. Teddy Kollek, the famous mayor of Jerusalem, used to say, let's resolve Jerusalem first, because if you resolve Jerusalem, then everything else is simple. So I may show you a map or two of Jerusalem, but we're not going to have time to discuss that today. If you want to invite me back sometime, I'll be happy to speak just about Jerusalem. And then, of course, Israel also has two maritime boundaries, one in the Mediterranean, one in the Gulf of Aqaba. The one in the Mediterranean, it claims territorial waters and territorial seas, but there are also issues relating to offshore resources, which could be conflictual between Israel and Lebanon. The blockade of Gaza doesn't allow ships in. And don't forget, Israel also has, in a sense, a maritime boundary with the European Union because of the EEZ, if you know what that is, the exclusive economic zone between Israel and Cyprus. Cyprus is part of the EU, and there is not 400 nautical miles between the Israeli coast and Cyprus. So there is a maritime boundary actually with the European Union. And in a very micro scale, Israel has a very interesting maritime boundary in the Gulf of Aqaba. Actually, Eilat, we often think of Eilat and Aqaba, but there are 4 international boundaries around by Eilat and Aqaba. There's Jordan, there's Israel, there's Egypt, and there's Saudi Arabia. And of course, each claims just a minimum territorial waters, and on the whole, for reasons of mutual realpolitik, the countries keep to that. But really, there is not much space there for any division of resources or division of ocean resources. And you may well ask, who needs to divide it? I couldn't agree with you, that question more than you. But of course, we know that countries like preserving and maintaining their own spaces. A very quick run through a series of maps to remind those of you who do know, to tell you that those who don't know. We go back 100 years to the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, and the region that we know as the Levant was divided between 2 mandate powers, between Britain and France. Britain took the southern section, France took the northern section. What you see here is the area of the British mandate, both colours, and in 1921, Britain then decided to split that territory into 2 along the Jordan River, created a new state, the Transjordan, which then gave over to the Hashemite family, who had been driven out of the holy places of Mecca and Medina by the Ikhwan, now the Saudi family, and the Hussein family have ruled in Jordan until then. So what you see there as the orange, that is the 25,000 square kilometers we're talking about. There was a big debate between the British and the French back then as to where the northern part of the British mandate would be. They wanted it to be further north in what is today Lebanon, because they wanted to control the waters of the River Litani, but eventually the League of Nations decided that this is where the border will be, and that's pretty much the border between Israel and Lebanon until today. If we go, that's Israel's borders today. We'll come back to that map later. You see the West Bank, the Golan heights and the Gaza Strip, with Egypt to the south, Jordan to the east, and Lebanon, Syria to the northeast, and Lebanon to the north. Very quickly, this is the Israeli-Lebanon border. It's the blue line is the border between Israel and Lebanon today. You do see, I don't know if you're following, does my mouse, can you see where I don't know if you can see my mouse going over the map or not, or it's only on my computer. There's a place here called the Shabbat Farms, which is under dispute as to whether it should really belong to Syria or to Lebanon, if and when there is a resolution of the conflict. But overall, this border is pretty much the line that was agreed upon between the British and the French mandates back in 100 years ago. You can see the blue line further to the north is Litani River, the 40 kilometers, which is, given the nature of the water situation in this region, all of the countries would very much like to have control of that. But it's well inside Lebanon, and that's where the water resources exist. We go partly to the east, to Israel-Syria. You see two lines here. You see the red line, which is the armistice agreement of 1948. That was Israel's border until 1967. In 1967, Israel conquered, captured, occupied the Golan Heights, and it has remained in the Golan Heights, which is considered by most Israelis to be a very important strategic resource because it sits well high above the rest of the land there. There's probably less agreement in Israel about doing a peace deal or returning any of the Golan Heights than any of the West Bank, particularly today when, of course, Syria is far less stable than it was 10 and 20 years ago. The purple you see to the right is an United Nations area which basically separates the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights from Syria itself. And today in the Golan Heights, there are probably around 50,000 people living there, of whom half are Israeli residents or settlers who have moved there since '67. The other half are mostly Druze, indigenous residents. People often forget, we talk a lot about the Palestinian refugees. There was also a major outflow of Arab refugees from the Golan Heights after the Six-Day War, which caused a significant depopulation of that area, and that would also have to be part of a discussion in the future Israeli-Syria peace agreement. We come to the Israel-Jordan border, which is the longest border, running from the far north to the far south. As I said, it is part of a peace agreement. And the area from the north down to the if you look down the line, you will see a green sort of line separating the Jordan border in the middle. That is the point where the West Bank turns into Israel. So when Israel made the agreement with Jordan, Jordan only agreed to sign on the maps of the border in those areas which were directly facing Israel. That part of the border, which is next to the West Bank, although it's clear where the border will be, and it's clear that it's the Jordan River, it's the Rift Valley, there's no question as to where the border will be, but Jordan refused to sign on maps on any of the area which neighbours or borders the West Bank, because, as they rightly argued, this should be done between Jordan and a future Palestinian state. So although we know exactly where the line is and will be, there is an agreed border in the northern section and the southern section, but not in the central section, which is known as the Jordan Valley, and which is up for grabs because the present Israeli government would like to annex that region unilaterally. And this is the exact region I'm talking about. Okay, you can see it runs partly down the valley into the northern section of the Dead Sea, and this dark blue area is what's called the Jordan Valley. Again, Israel argues that this is important for its strategic. It has to control the border even if the rest of the West Bank is a Palestinian state, and that's going to be extremely contentious if and when the new government is sworn in the next few days. Not necessarily. We could well end up having fourth elections in 6 months' time. But Netanyahu would like to annex that area to Israel, and that has been a discussion which has been ongoing for the entire 50 years since occupation began in 1967. We come to the Israel-Egypt border, and of course the Camp David peace agreements of the late 70s and early 80s between Prime Minister Begin, President Sadat, and President Jimmy Carter took basically Egypt out of the major confrontation with Israel which changed an important way of thinking for most Israelis, because Egypt was the one country it was always felt that threatened Israel's very existence at that stage, an era before ballistic missiles, which should be mentioned. That has again changed the strategic balance in recent years. And that is the border running down Egypt and Israel with the Sinai Peninsula, which was actually conquered by Israel in the Six-Day War, and as part of the peace agreement, returned the whole of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and went back again, more or less, to the border which had been agreed upon 100 years ago by the British Mandate authorities, and it runs down to that point where it meets the Jordan border at Eilat Aqaba Tava and the Red Sea. We always get mixed up between the Red Sea here and the Dead Sea further up, and that is the Israel-Egypt border. The Gaza Strip, very small area, tens of kilometers, which, as you know, is enclosed in, is very sensitive. And again, I'll show you some pictures of that in a minute. And then we get back to the real big issue, Israel, the West Bank border, the Green Line. The Green Line, as you see, separating Israel from the West Bank, was a border which was, again, one of the four armistice agreements of 1949, which were negotiated separately between Israel and Lebanon, Israel and Syria, Israel and Jordan, Israel and Egypt at the Rhodes Armistice talks in 1949. The Green Line pretty much reflects where the armed forces were at the end of Israel's War of Independence, or the Palestinian Nakba. It wasn't a great border at that time, it should be said. And it could be argued that it's not a great border today. Now, as we'll talk in about 15, 20 minutes about, you know, the basic notion that what you should do is you should go back to the 67 borders. But that is, in a sense, a default situation if the two sides can't agree to renegotiate and really demarcate a border which was bad then and which is even worse today. Let's not forget that the West Bank as a geographical, political entity has only been in existence since 1949. So it was only really in existence in that sense for 19 years before Israel occupied the West Bank in 67. It still is an important administrative boundary because, of course, Israel is not sovereign in any of the West Bank. But notwithstanding, we should remember that sometimes borders come into being. Let's go back even to Central and Eastern Europe 100 years ago. So lots of new borders were drawn up, and in a very short period of time, they become sacrosanct. So people always say, this is the real border, this is the default border, let's go back to that border. Sometimes it is more relevant, and sometimes it is less relevant. The ideal situation for Israel and a future Palestinian state would be for a bilateral renegotiated border, which would leave at the very minimum both the Palestinians with the same amount of territory that they have in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But as we shall see, Trump is trying to change the ground rules of that argument, and that could be very significant in the coming months and the coming years. For those of you who are not aware, that the actual partition proposal between a Jewish and an Arab state, which was voted on by the United Nations at the end of 47 in Flushing Meadows, this was the map that was voted on. This was the partition proposal. As it was, a war developed in 48-49, and the borders turned out to be rather different. They turned out to be this. But if you look at the original partition proposal, and all of that in orange would have been an Arab stroke Palestinian state, all of that in green would have been a Jewish stroke Israeli state, as the state came to be known, the State of Israel. And I like this map. Oh, where am I? I've lost it. Hang about. Why? Sorry, let's go. Why is it playing up now? Oh, no, excuse me. Okay. And I think this is a very nice simplistic map, but it shows the difference between the borders of what was proposed at the United Nations partition and what actually became Israel's borders after the war. We can go into historical analysis of saying, why was there a war? Why didn't both sides just sign up on the agreement? Who were the rejectionists, etc., etc.? But that is the geopolitical reality that turned out after 1948. One of my favorite maps is this one you see on the plate here. I came across this recently, and what you have here is a map showing the partition proposal, but it says on this plate, the Republic of Israel, May the 14th, 1948. And the quotation in the plate, if you will, it's no legend, is a famous quotation, mythified and reputed to be made by Theodor Herzl back in the First Zionist Congress at the end of the 19th century. But the interesting thing about this map is you can really pinpoint the date of when this souvenir plate was made, because it has the Republic of Israel, May 14th, 48. So it was after the formal establishment or announcement of the State of Israel, but it still has the partition map, which means it was before the Rhodes Agreement. In other words, this souvenir plate made by supporters of the new State of Israel in the United States of America was obviously created as a souvenir during the 1 year period between the establishment of the state and the actual delineation of the boundaries. And I would love to get hold of one of those plates. So if any of you ever walk into an auction shop in the middle of nowhere and see one of them on a shelf, just buy it and send it to me, and I'll pay whatever it costs. It's really quite a unique map plate for someone who is interested in borders and in maps and in Israel-Palestine. As I said, we won't have time to talk about Jerusalem, which again was separated in 1949. The blue became the west of Jerusalem. The orange was part of Jordan. You can see the green line running around it. In 1967, when Israel conquered Jerusalem, it immediately passed the law of annexation, taking in East Jerusalem and expanding the whole municipal area, so that the municipal area of today of Jerusalem is the whole of the yellow that you see in that map. As I say, that's another whole big issue, which we simply won't have time to talk about here today. Time is moving on. Let's say something very briefly about walls, fences, and barriers. I'm going to run through these very quickly. As you know, Israel has built a separation stroke security wall barrier fence between Israel and the West Bank. It started this about 12, 13 years, no, even more, 15 years ago, because there were many people who argued that we have to stop all these people coming through from the West Bank and putting bombs in our shopping centers and our buses. And the only way to do it is to create a new physical divide. Let's not forget that in the 80s and 90s, many of the border scholars, we were all talking about borderless worlds. The Berlin Wall had fallen, and we were counting every year how many walls have fallen and been destroyed. Ever since 9/11, we've gone in a reverse direction. We've been building new walls and new fences all over the place. And the two most prominent are probably the Israel-West Bank wall and the USA-Mexico wall, but there are many others all around the world. Of the border between Israel and the West Bank today, about less than 15% is actually wall, the rest is fence, serious fence, 3 layers of barbed wire with electronic and sometimes electric surveillance. But nevertheless, in many areas, these big walls have been built, particularly in and around Jerusalem, particularly in and around the areas where there are strong residential concentrations on both sides. And beyond anything else, it looks ugly. But it causes significant geographic dislocation and displacement. And we would hope that if and when there is to be some sort of future agreement, which doesn't seem on the table at the moment, we would hope that they would do away with these walls, but you can't guarantee it. Within the West Bank as well, there are areas, if you as an Israeli drive through, that you are not allowed into the Oslo Agreement. There are areas A and areas B and areas C, so you find in many different languages telling you as you drive along the roads which are the areas which are safe, which are allowed to be driven into, and which can't. And that applies actually to both Israelis and Palestinians, although it goes without saying that Israel has much greater control in this respect. In recent years, there's also been a wall and a barrier built along much of the Israel-Egypt border. For 30 years after the Israel-Egypt peace agreement, the area was pretty much open, and there were no problems along the Israel-Egypt border. And they started talking about building a wall some 15 to 20 years ago, not because of issues of terror or ISIS, which hadn't arisen yet, but because of what Israel saw as a problem of refugees and migrants coming in from Sudan and Ethiopia and Somalia through the Sinai Peninsula and then coming into Israel and taking up places as migrant workers, particularly in the Tel Aviv area. The normal discourse around migrants and illegal migrants took place, and Israel decided it was going to build a wall along this vast area. When it started building the wall, the new terrorism arose. ISIS took up home in much of the Sinai Peninsula, so that gave a boost to the government, and they completed this wall along the entirety of the Israel-Egypt border. The Gaza Strip, as you know, is pretty much enclosed. The north and the east by, again, a big wall. The south by Egypt, which also has a wall and very heavy fortifications between Egypt and Gaza. And in the Mediterranean Sea, Israel tends to have a blockade on the maritime boundaries because it doesn't allow flotillas to come in to the Gaza Strip because they argue it's going to be full of arms or weapons or what have you. So Gaza is a micro, densely populated and basically besieged area, which of course is very problematic, which also explains much of the tensions that goes on between Gaza and Israel. Walls and comparative perspectives, along came your neighboring president, Mr. Netanyahu's best friend, President Trump, 2 years ago, visited the Western Wall, and everybody was second guessing, what did Mr. Trump have to write on the, everyone goes to the Western Wall and writes a note and puts it in and hopes that God, if he's around, reads it and answers their prayers. And there were hundreds, literally tens, if not hundreds, of caricatures that came out. These were two of the best. I'm sure you've read them in the last few seconds. And I think it says something about the concept of the wall. I love the one about the contractor. When Israel did start building the walls, and this is very interesting as a matter of fact, it then, this is a serious advert that was in all the newspapers, putting it out to tender. In other words, putting it out to private contractors to build the walls. They were obviously given certain security conditions, what sort of surveillance, what sort of height, what its purpose was, and they looked for private contractors to build the wall, to privatize the building. And there were different ways to build the walls. You could either do it through Lego, you could go to IKEA. No, I'm not being serious. Again, but there were big questions, as you know, as to who builds the wall, who funds the wall, and a lot of these jokes fall back on President Trump. Is the barrier between Israel and the West Bank, is it just a security barrier, as Israeli governments, including Ariel Sharon, who was the prime minister who started building the wall, is it just a security barrier as he would like to have it done, or is it an international border? And I think these pictures speak for themselves. You can't drive freely through the barrier. If you're a Palestinian, you certainly can't drive freely into Israel. You're not allowed to bring your car into Israel at all. You have to come through on foot, where you're checked and double-checked and triple-checked, and then you're met by Israeli employers on the Israeli side who then, ship you off to menial labor in the local towns. A lot very similar to the way things happen between the USA and Mexico. But I live actually in a community called Meitar, just south of the West Bank. And if you go along to that border area at 4 o'clock in the morning, you see literally thousands of Palestinians coming. The other side has become a makeshift car park and also informal commerce of people selling food and so on. People come through, they're checked. And actually, because of the corona experience, Israel basically sent or pushed all the Palestinians back into the West Bank, because normally they have to return every day. Because of the small size of the territory here, it can be a daily commute from the West Bank into Israel and back. But as Corona moved along, Israel earmarked so many thousands of Palestinians who it said, if you want to come and work in Israel, you come, but you're staying here for 6 weeks and you're not going home. And it made the employers create makeshift residences for them. But that was exceptional. On the whole, it's a daily process of coming in and coming out. If I, as an Israeli, want to drive the other way in the West Bank, through the West Bank, because I'm doing research, because I want to see what's going on there, I have a completely different sort of document or visa. I drive up to the barrier, and the Israeli security guard sees an Israeli car, Israeli and Palestinian cars have separate license plates, and he says to me in nice colloquial Hebrew, "Good morning, how are you?" And I answer him back in equally nice colloquial Hebrew, "Everything is just great," and up the barrier goes, and through I go. So there's a very clear selection and discrimination about who can go through and in what direction. How are these borders crossed? Well, we do have some land borders. At Taba, we have Israel welcome to Egypt. A few kilometers north, we have welcome to Jordan. And what's interesting and even amusing is that the border between Israel and Jordan is called the Yitzhak Rabin border, after the assassinated prime minister. The border between Israel and Egypt is called the Menachem Begin border, the Israeli prime minister. I mean, obviously, I'm talking about it from the Israeli side of the border, the prime minister who did the peace deal with Egypt. And actually, the border with Jordan on the other side is called the King Hussein border. So if you're a prime minister or a king, one thing you'll get named after you in the Middle East is a border crossing post. This is to the Gaza Strip. We'll go over that. Now, there are many ways that borders are crossed. I mean, people travel through borders, as I've just explained. It's much quicker for me if I wanted to go to Jerusalem every day from where I live. It's actually quicker for me to go through the border and through the West Bank. It's half the distance than driving around the West Bank, although even then the distances aren't great. It's 70 kilometers one way, but with a lot of danger, and it's 120 kilometers the other way with no danger. And it goes without saying that 95% of people choose to go the 120 kilometer route. David Newman doesn't always choose that route. Emmanuel's been with me, I think, on a trip through the West Bank to see what's going on there. But there are many other ways of crossing the border. You're all aware from the news that missiles cross borders. It doesn't matter how high the wall is, where the wall is, missiles will always go over borders. You'll get the dome system you see in the picture below firing missiles back or trying to knock out the missiles in the air. And you can see the sort of zones of where very simple ballistic missiles can reach from the Gaza Strip into virtually into the heart of Israel, because Israel is such a small country. You think of the same thing happening in the north of Hezbollah and Lebanon. So obviously there's a new type of war in this region. Until 20 years ago, Israel was always prided itself that when it fought wars, it could take the war, in a sense, into the neighboring territory. Today, that's not the case. Today, there's a whole homeland security unit in the army, which never used to exist. And of course, the major threats today are not from an invasion from another territory, but from missiles. And I'm sure you all watch the news and know what the situation is. The reaction is always far stronger than the initial missiles, and then there's a whole debate which goes on around the world. How is Israel proportional or disproportional in its response, and is there such a thing as proportionality or disproportionality in this sort of warfare and in this sort of conflict? Another way of crossing the border is by digging tunnels. Some extremely sophisticated tunnels. One of these, I can't remember which, is from the Israel-Gaza border. The other is from the Israel-Lebanon border. And the map that you see shows the route of the tunnels that were discovered. And a lot of technology which is going on today on the Israeli side, the R&D, is creating all sorts of infrared robots and snakes which dig underground and detect where the tunnels are. And then the army comes in, obviously, and blows them up. So getting under the walls is another way of crossing borders. We invest millions and billions into border walls and border defences. And more recently, we found out that a child just has to have a birthday balloon, put an incendiary on it, let it float over the border. They cost a few dollars each, $1 each a balloon, and it can set fire to fields on the other side. So we have to ask ourselves, what good does it do to invest all these billions if it's so easy to cross borders in that way? This is what I told you about before, the two ways I can travel from the southern point to Jerusalem. I can go the short way or the long way, and you see a sign saying Jerusalem via Hebron, which means via the West Bank, 70 kilometers. I got the longer route, but the safer route is 117 kilometers. Season of goodwill for all men, and people come to Bethlehem from all around the world. And as they move from the airport through Jerusalem to Bethlehem, they encounter a big wall and they have to get through that one. And there are quite a number of caricatures about this. This is meant to be animated and is meant to show people digging a tunnel, but obviously it's not working right now. But it shows the absurdity of the walls there. And this, I have to admit, I only got a few days ago. It is, at the moment, of 400 border caricatures I have, it is my number one. It is my favorite. I don't need to explain it to anyone. Billions put into walls, into missiles, into tanks. And ladies and gentlemen, we're all living in the era of coronavirus, which simply flies in the air above all these walls, and it raises questions as to what exactly walls and borders, what are their real functions in life and for societies and for states. There have been some attempts at cross-border cooperation. I'm going to have to skip this piece, but this is the River Jordan Peace Park. This is a cross-border cooperation sewage treatment between Israel and the West Bank. Suffice to say, neither of them function anymore. They both functioned for a few years, and then they fell apart as distrust grew and as political tensions grew. Let's move into the last section and talk about the cartographic problems at demarcating a future border between Israel and the Palestinian State. Both of these caricatures are 25 years old, from the times of the Oslo agreements. The personalities have changed. Not a single personality on any of those maps, Rabin, Hussein, Arafat, Assad the father, none of them are alive anymore. But the basic question is exactly the same. Along comes the bloated or fat map of Israel, including the West Bank, and it says to the severe-looking train of Prime Minister Rabin, how much of this shape do I have to change in order to please all of these spectators? And then when they get down to actually drawing the border, they understand it's a much more complex issue than simply drawing a line, because for every function that you want a border to operate, whether it's for security or for water or for transportation or for identity or for residence, for sovereignty, each one has its own line. And it becomes much more complex than anyone ever realized. And as the years go by, it becomes more and more complex. So what do we need to know about demarcating borders as part of a solution? Today I should put that word two-state in parentheses, in brackets, because it's not clear whether a two-state solution, even for those of us who have supported it for a long period of time, whether pragmatically it's a realistic option anymore as facts on the ground change so quickly. First, we have to know, do you negotiate with friends or enemies? The greatest problem of the so-called Trump peace deal is that it was sorted out between Trump and Netanyahu, and hey, guess what? There's another side out there called the Palestinians who had absolutely nothing to do with the discussions, which is why the proposed territorial solution weighs so heavily against them. Borders or separation barriers are unilaterally superimposed by one side. As we've seen, all of the walls that we've looked at in this presentation have been built unilaterally by Israel, whether the other side wants them or not. Do we overemphasize the so-called de facto border of the Green Line? As I said before, it was a bad border at the time. It's even worse today. And let's not forget that since the Six-Day War, over 50 years has passed, which is 3 times as much a length of time as had passed between the establishment of the state in 48 and the Six-Day War itself. And over 50 years, facts change on the ground, not least Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which today have something like 500,000 residents, 500,000 residents, and that's not even including East Jerusalem in this discussion. Now, we can have a whole political argument as to whether that's legal or illegal, whether it's just or unjust, but it's changed the geographical realities on the ground. I mean, some Israeli residents in the West Bank are already into their third and fourth generation. You know, that's nearly as long as the French were in North Africa. The realities on the ground have changed, and what does that mean? Does it mean that we have to take that into account, or can we simply go back and say, this is where we were in '67, that's where we have to go back to? And I say that as someone on the pro-peace side, that we have to look at realities and think, how does that change the way that we negotiate peace agreements? No government in Israel, including a left-wing government, which, as you know, we haven't had for 10 years and are unlikely to have for the next 5 to 10 years. But no government is going to be able or want to evacuate 500,000 settlers. It's not going to be able to do it. It's going to cause civil war. And the Gaza experience of 15 years ago is no longer a precedent which can be taken into account. There are much more radical groups out there today who would cause significant problems. Can you have borders with exclaves and enclaves? These are questions being asked today. Security arrangements for whom? Sovereignty for whom? All of these are issues which have to be taken into account. The Oslo Accords created this map, whereby all the green and brown colors were Palestinian autonomy areas, and all the rest still remained under Israeli control, largely because of the settlements, which you see here. The darker brown areas and the purple areas are areas controlled by Israeli settlements. Remember, it's not just the houses themselves, it's also the land they fence in for industrial areas, commercial areas, public spaces, and so on. And if you look at the course of the separation barrier, we looked at the wall before. If you look at the red line, that is the separation barrier, and that's where the separation barrier deviates from the green line itself. And in 95% of cases, it deviates from the green line where there are Israeli settlements. That is the reason why it is deviated. These are the areas that Israel has always said it wants to keep under any future agreement. By taking away land from the Palestinians or by swapping land with the Palestinians, that remains an open question. Jerusalem, as I say, is much more complex. You can see the impact of the settlements on this border. And then we come to the latest game in town, the Trump deal of the century, which was so proudly announced by Trump and Netanyahu. And suddenly along came the American government and said, we say that Israel can annex the settlements. Even Israel has never done that over 50 years. It has done it to East Jerusalem. It's done it to the Golan Heights, but it's understood that the international community, if I can use a British understatement, as you can tell from my accent, would not be too pleased with that. So they've avoided actually formally annexing the settlements, even though all of the residents there are subject to Israeli civilian law, unlike the Palestinian residents of the West Bank. And along comes the United States of America, Israel's biggest ally and supporter, and says, you can annex these settlements, in return for which you have to create a Palestinian state on the rest of the West Bank. Immediately came out with a statement. Netanyahu said, come on, let's go annex the settlements. And his right-wing politicians friends suddenly, and Trump quickly stepped in and said, no, this is a package deal. If you're going to annex the settlements, you have to then announce the creation of a Palestinian state and the rest of it. And it was held up. There were more elections. We still don't have a new government. But Netanyahu has always said the first thing he wants to do when he does have a new government, if he has a new government, is to undertake the annexation. What does that mean for Palestinian statehood? Big question mark. And not only, sorry about that one, and this is what the map would look like under the Trump-Netanyahu plan. If you compare that to the green line, you can see it takes land away from the Palestinians in the West Bank, but it offers strange areas of land along the Israel-Egypt border, hardly connected to each other, in order to expand the land base of the Gaza Strip. No one was really asked about this. This is what the suggestion was, because they came to the conclusion that whatever the percentage of land or the actual size of the West Bank, that is the total area of land that the Palestinians should have under a future agreement, so they had to compensate for land somewhere else. It's not a new idea for land swaps. It has been suggested in the past, largely along the Green Line itself, or largely, as you saw in the previous map, sparsely populated areas on the Israel-Egypt border. But there have also been the right wing in Israel said, let's redraw the West Bank in the northern zone, where there are large Arab Palestinian populations on the Israeli side. Let's draw the borders around them so they then become part of the Palestinian state without getting their consent, without asking them, because every public survey shows they are not keen, again, to use an understatement, to be part of a Palestinian state, particularly in its first years, until they see what sort of regime and democracy will be there. And it's, you know, it's like the famous old joke where people say a grandfather tells his grandson that over the course of his life he's lived in 4 different countries as a young kid, as a student, as an adult, and his grandson says, how come you moved around so much in a pre-mobile area? And this guy who grew up in Central Eastern Europe answers, I never left the house I was born in. They just kept having wars and agreements without my agreement, and they kept redrawing the boundary around my house. So every few years I found myself a resident of a different country. Things like that happened in Central and Eastern Europe 100 years ago. Some right-wing politicians in Israel would like to see it happen with the Israel-Palestine boundary. Again, it's unlikely, but it's a sort of, in a sense, it's like a population transfer, but without the people actually leaving their houses. Can we think beyond the territorial box? And I'm coming to the end. I know I've overrun my time. Can we think beyond the territorial box, sharing power without borders, federal and confederal solutions, which were discussed 30 years ago and then were pushed aside as being too American and not relevant to the Middle East? Exclaves, enclaves, are these ivory tower dreams? Are they real issues? There are think tanks out there which are discussing these ideas, as we realize it's become almost impossible to draw a single boundary line between a future Israel and a Palestinian state. It's always the stronger side that can impose boundaries or superimpose boundaries, and we see certainly with the case of the separation barrier, that's what Israel has done. You may end up in such a complex area living in a shared space, which sounds utopian. But a single state, but of course most Israelis are against that. They want a Jewish state with a Jewish majority. And what happens in a shared space like that, you end up having contested spaces and conflict all over again. So you can realize what the dilemmas are here. There's a dynamic which is going on, which has been going on really for 70 years, certainly since the establishment of the state, ever since the earliest partitions. Some boundary issues have been worked out, if it be with Egypt and Jordan, even if they require borders and hard fences, it's better than having war and conflict. Others need to be resolved, and the greatest problematic, Israel, the West Bank and the Palestinian state, in my personal view, seems no closer to resolution than it has been in the last 50 years. And to put it very simply, I don't see the Trump deal going anywhere, not in the short term and not in the long term. And unfortunately, I think we're going to have to have more conflict and more tension, and we need a new form of leadership on both sides in order to move this thing forward. Thank you very much.
Okay, David, thank you very much. Are people able to see me? I'm trying to turn my video on. We have a little time now for questions from our audience. Thank you again for a very, very rich, very informative, if pessimistic, if somewhat depressing at the same time, but that's the case here, isn't it? I'm not sure if I've actually come up yet as a video. So for questions, if I could remind people to please keep those questions brief. If we don't have a lot of time, please also ask the question as opposed to a longer observation. And if you could keep the questions on topic, we have so much material to cover as well. That would be very, very much appreciated. Perhaps you could either use the chat box, which Jody and Stephanie are keeping track of, or raise your hand. You should see a little icon at the very bottom. Okay, we do have a question. David, can you, which just disappeared again. Our first question is from Matthew. How have hydrological watershed boundaries been considered, if at all?
Yes, very much so, particularly in the case of Israel and the West Bank, because there is a large underground aquifer which runs beneath both Israel and the West Bank. And of course, no magic iron boundary separates the Palestinian water from the Israeli water. For many years, that underground aquifer was getting used up because of the drought. But in the last 2 years, there's been quite a bountiful rainfall in Israel and the region. And that's therefore being filled up to a great extent. Back in the days of Oslo, there were always 5 issues that were, in a sense, had to be negotiated over the next few years. They were boundaries, they were settlements, they were Jerusalem, they were refugees, and they were water. And the only one that had any really serious discussion and was moving anywhere was the issue of water, because people realized that this is a human resource which everyone needs in order to live, even though Israel restricted the Palestinian drilling of wells and the new water sources in the West Bank, which meant huge difficulties for new Palestinian residences and new communities. But nevertheless, the one multilateral, and if I remember correctly, I think Canada were quite involved in the water multilateral. That was the only one that was going anywhere, because it was realized that, it was understood this was a common resource that had to be dealt with. But yes, water has always been a big issue. It's less of an issue today than it was 20, 30 years ago, if only because Israel has invested strongly in the last 15 years into desalination plants, which it didn't used to for political reasons, internal political reasons. And today, something like 60 or 70% of our domestic consumption comes from desalination.
Thank you, David. Ben has a question for us. David, you talked about, quote, functions. On a theoretical level, would these functions which you speak of illustrate a theory of, quote, functional borders?
The point I'm trying to make is to say that, if you look back 100 years ago, borders, the physical borders, separated lots of things between countries. Today, walls can still separate physical movement of people, those who don't come on a plane or by other means. But at the end of the day, most of our interest in borders today is how we manage them, the power relations. By that I mean functional. Who is allowed to cross? What sort of customs duties are there? How are crossings controlled? What documentation and visas do you need to cross? Can you get through legally or illegally? To what extent is there cooperation across the borders on issues of common concern, such as ecology and environmental issues? That's what I mean by functional issues. They are the important issues about borders today. You draw them at a certain point in time, and unless you go to war again in the near future, that remains the line. And then the whole question always is how you manage them. Are they open or are they closed? Do you want relationships on both sides? Are there joint cultural interests? Are there frontier zones? But what is the dynamics of the bordering process rather than where is the location of the border?
David, can I ask a little, I think it's a follow-up on that. You stated on a few occasions that you thought that those armistice lines from 1949, basically a green line drawn up by soldiers on a map where the Jordanian army and the Israeli army met, that's a bad border. Now I'm sort of interested as a border theorist, what a good border, it does raise the question what a good border is. And then when you showed us some of the other attempts, whether that be that 2006 depiction of a wall or the Trump plan, they too look bad. So
yeah, that I agree with you. I mean, what I meant by that was that they reflected the realities of the day. Had the borders been drawn 6 months earlier or 6 months later with the troops being in different positions, it's very likely the border would have worked out differently. There was also an agreement between Israel and Jordan, because actually there were also Iraqi forces controlling a certain area in the Northwest Bank, and Jordan wanted them out as much as the Israelis wanted them out. So there was an agreement about the northern border. It was very much based on bartering and trading and realities of that day. the actual war of 48-49 took place in 2 phases. And there was a short period of a few weeks in the middle when there was a sort of a ceasefire. At the time, the commander of the Israeli Palmach forces, Yigal Allon, came to Ben-Gurion and said, look, we're turning the tide. We could now go into the mountainous area, it wasn't yet called the West Bank, and we could get as far as the Jordan River. And Ben-Gurion is reported to have said, we don't want those areas. We don't want mountains. We don't want areas which are densely populated. We want to go south. We need areas for future expansion and development. And that's when the Israeli army went south and took over the Negev as far as Eilat. And only 19 years later did it come back to the issue of the West Bank. So that was a realistic, I mean, you could argue that was a right argument or a wrong argument, but that was the realistic way that the sort of army commanders and the political leaders of the time looked at the future borders. There's a very interesting quotation. You know, Israel's foremost diplomat in history was Abba Eban, who was both the ambassador to the United States and to the United Nations from the establishment of the state for almost 15 years, and he was in his 30s. You know, he was a young 30-year-old Cambridge graduate going and setting up new embassies with the United States and with the United Nations, and he was on the left of the political map. He was always in favor of negotiating peace. In one of his books, he says he came to Ben-Gurion in the early 50s and he said, look, the war turned out as it did. This is the reality of today. Why don't we go and negotiate with the Arab states and make these our de jure international boundaries? And Ben-Gurion is reputed to have said to him, by the way, and the Arab states didn't want to talk to Israel at the time, so it was irrelevant, but Ben-Gurion is reputed to have said to him, no, he says, we don't want to do that. He says, we want to leave the borders elastic. We want to leave them in the armistice stage. We don't know what's going to happen 5 or 10 years down the road, and it will be much easier to change borders if they don't have full de jure international status than if they're still in this sort of uncertain armistice status. You could argue that was a prophecy on Ben-Gurion's part. I don't think you could argue that in 1951 he planned the Six-Day War, but nevertheless it says something about, you know, that borders at any point in time reflect where the armed forces are, reflect who has the power to determine where the borders are. The border of the Green Line, the West Bank, didn't reflect any previous border that had ever been in that area in history.
No. I think there's a follow-up question to that as well. Rod asks, could we speculate a bit on the shape of a leadership that would be required, I suppose on both sides, to have any realistic participation in the process of border making in the future, in terms of the legitimacy of that within the populations?
Well, border making, what he means by that is leaders who really wanted to make peace and not just to use it as a mantra. And making peace means borders, but it means a lot of other things as well. We don't have the leadership today. You have a very powerful leader in Israel. You may like or dislike him. Anyone who knows my politics knows which side of the fence I come in that one, but he's been prime minister for over 10 years, longer than Ben-Gurion has. He's holding on by his teeth to the prime ministership, not least because of these fraud cases which have been set up against him. He hasn't really made any significant move on the peace front. He's been helped by the fact that the Palestinian side also haven't. We don't have a leadership who think in those terms today. It would need a different leadership. And without over-reflecting my own personal opinions on this, I would say that you need leaders on both sides who understand that when you use the word compromise, it's not just a word which is taken out of a dictionary. Compromise means compromise. Compromise doesn't mean exchanging 2 meters of land here with 5 meters of land in another place, changing a small demilitarized zone for an extra water reservoir. Compromise means being the willingness to compromise on the really big issues. There are big issues out there. The big issues are about Palestinian statehood. They're about how and who controls Jerusalem. They're about the law of return. I'm about the law of return for Palestinians, not for for Israelis and so on. And we don't see that the sides are really prepared to make compromises, because each is also, not only because I don't think they move in that direction, but also because they will have a domestic constituency at home, which in the last 15 years on both sides has moved from the left to the centre and from the centre to the right, and from the right to the even more radical right, and therefore more intransigent than they were 10 and 15 years ago. And at the end of the day, the economic quality of life in Israel is not bad. And people consider North Tel Aviv, they can be left of centre people, pro-peace, anti-Netanyahu. They sit 20 minutes away from the West Bank. They never go there. They never cross the Green Line. At the most, they may see it in a distance from one of Israel's main highways. And as long as they can go to their jobs and they can have their coffee in North Tel Aviv, they're not prepared to go out of their way to make huge political issues which could cause internal instability. So to a certain extent, the relative quality of life which takes place in Israel today, even for the left of centre pro-peace constituents, actually is something which deters any major move towards pushing the government into creating a new peace agreement.
Okay, thank you. We have time for a couple more questions. There's a follow-up question on the water issue. Is there more to say about the role of agricultural land, as particularly in terms of food security or self-sufficiency for a Palestinian state, how that could factor into, or how that would factor into the border land swapping question?
Yeah, food security I don't think has been a major issue. I think, food and agriculture travels fairly freely. Or let me put this another way. When Israel was first founded, agriculture was a big thing. And it was important both because of the sort of return to the land ethos of the earliest Zionist settlers, and also because it was felt that given Israel's situation at the time, it had to be self-sufficient in food. The world has changed, and Israel imports a tremendous amount of its agricultural produce, and lots of the land that used to be put over to citrus fruits and cotton, which, by the way, are huge guzzlers of water, are now put over to new residential units and concrete throughout the center of the country. Remember, the population is a very rapidly growing population relative to most Western societies. The outlet for the Palestinians on the whole is because the very strongly socialized, protected Israeli market doesn't want cheap agricultural produce coming in from the West Bank. Some does come through, but not a great deal. And that has been one of the main reasons why the borders between the West Bank and Jordan going east have always been open to allow a huge flow of agricultural produce out into Jordan and even further afield. There is the question of, Israeli and Palestinian employers in general, not just agriculturalists, because as I say, Israel is a strongly protected economy, and therefore production costs are much, much higher than they are in the West Bank. But I don't see that would or should be a major problem.
It reminds me, it strikes me that this is at the core of, what a Gordian knot we have here in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the extent to which early Zionist immigrants settled on land that was agriculturally rich in the plains and the valleys, ignoring in large part the mountainous areas. The irony there being that those mountainous areas were the sites of religious significance. So you have a Palestinian state that was carved out on land that was more biblically important.
That was definitely a conscious decision, but not necessarily or not exclusively because of the reasons you raise here, but because all of the early sort of Zionist return to land, the pioneers from the late 19th, early 20th centuries, were very much into this socialist orientation which ruled Israel until the late 70s, and which believed very much in the agricultural cooperatives of the kibbutz, the moshav. This was an ethos which had huge social and political significance as well. So in fact, it wasn't interested in going to the mountains. It wanted areas where it could do extensive agriculture. And to a certain extent, that worked out for it, because the mountains with the terraced agriculture and the vineyards and so on were the more densely populated areas, be they in the Galilee or be they in the West Bank.
Yeah, I just wonder if had the new state of Israel when it was created, included the biblical lands in the first place. Perhaps the question of settlements wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it was argued. I mean, if you look at a suburban map of Israel in the 50s and 60s, if you take a normal concentric ring and you say, you know, a city and an ex-urban areas grow out from the center, from the CBD outwards, and of course Israel until 67 grew up and down the coast, north and south, because it was only limited. It could only go about 20 kilometers to the east, because then you hit the Green Line and you hit the West Bank. So what did the earliest settlers in the 70s do, and what's been going, why have they managed to attract so many people over 50 years? Because they haven't created new agricultural settlements there. They've simply opened up the area to commuting, to suburbanization. People who live in the West Bank, the vast majority of them are no more than half now, with all the new roads and everything, are very rarely more than 40 minutes away from the major Tel Aviv or Jerusalem major metropolitan centers. So they just need land to build houses and roads and buildings. They don't need extensive areas of land for agriculture.
Well, David, I think we've run out of questions, but we're also running out of time. So let me take this moment to thank you so much. As you said, perhaps the ease with which we can bring you into these discussions now will hopefully encourage more opportunities for these discussions in the future. David, thank you so much. And thank you to Jody and Stephanie. Oliver, would you like to make any last minute announcements? Perhaps not. Oh.
No, thank you very much, David. That was fabulous.
And thank you also to Emmanuel and the big project.
Okay, nice speaking to you all. Okay.
Thank
I
you.
see someone just wrote, come back and talk about Jerusalem. I'll be happy